All right, let's get into it. Today, we are opening a really dark chapter of English history to try and understand the man who basically turned fear into a profession. His name was Matthew Hopkins, and he gave himself the title of Witchfinder General. Now, in just 2 absolutely brutal years, he and his small company were responsible for the deaths of more people than in the entire previous century of English witch trials combined. It's a legacy of horror that, honestly, serves as a chilling warning to this very day.
Our story really begins with this just bizarre and chilling description of a demonic familiar. And it's written by the man at the very center of all this. He claimed this creature, Vinegar Tom, and a few others with names like Holt, Jermera, and, get this, Sack and Sugar, were the imps of accused witches. This really sets the stage for a time when these beings weren't just figures of fantasy. No, they were believed to be terrifyingly real agents of Satan, suckling on the blood of his followers in exchange for the power to wither crops, kill livestock, and even murder children.
So, to really get a handle on the rise of Matthew Hopkins, we first have to understand the world that created him. You see, he wasn't some isolated monster who just appeared out of nowhere. He was a symptom of a sick and fractured society, a man who saw an opportunity in absolute, total chaos.
Okay, so picture England in the 1640s. The nation is literally tearing itself apart. The English Civil War wasn't just some political squabble between the king and Parliament. It was a deep, spiritual conflict that just shattered centuries of established order. The authority of the Church of England? Broken. And in its place, especially in counties like Essex and Suffolk, a really fervent, intolerant Puritanism took hold. And this was a belief system completely convinced that the end times were near and that Satan was right here, on Earth, actively recruiting soldiers for his army. So amid all the bloodshed, the paranoia, and this intense religious anxiety, well, it created the perfect storm for a moral panic.
And it was right at this moment that a lawyer of but little note stepped out of obscurity. Matthew Hopkins wasn't a theologian. He wasn't some renowned scholar. He was a failed lawyer who realized that in a world turned completely upside down, a new kind of power was available to the man who could promise to root out the hidden evil that everyone was terrified was living right next door.
So, how did he do it? How did one man convince entire towns to hand over their neighbors to the gallows? Well, his power didn't lie in magic. It lay in a systematic, brutal, and psychologically devastating methodology that was specifically designed to produce confessions, whether they were true or not.
His first and, you could argue, most cruel method was sleep deprivation, which he called watching. The victim, who was usually an elderly woman, was placed in the center of a room, forced into a really uncomfortable position, and then watched, day and night. She was forbidden to sleep, sometimes for 24 hours straight, but often for days on end. Any fly or spider that happened to enter the room was immediately deemed a potential familiar and killed. After days of this torment, the mind just breaks. Hallucinations start, and a confession, where you'll name anyone and anything, becomes the only possible path to escape the waking nightmare.
Next up was the infamous swimming test. This was a terrifying no-win situation. The accused was bound, right thumb to left big toe, left thumb to right big toe, a position that was said to mock the cross in their Christian faith. Then they were just thrown into a pond or a river. If they sank and drowned, they were considered innocent. If they floated, they were guilty and would be pulled out just to be hanged. Now, what's really fascinating here is the so-called logic behind it.
And this quote right here just brilliantly illustrates the justification they used. This wasn't some ancient folk custom. It was an idea endorsed by the King of England himself in his book on witchcraft. The belief was that water, the pure element of Christian baptism, would literally physically reject a witch who had renounced their faith. It was presented as a divine sign, a trial by God himself, when in reality, it was a trial by executioner with a completely predetermined outcome.
And finally, for the crucial piece of so-called physical evidence, Hopkins and his female assistant would strip the accused and search their body for proof. They were looking for the devil's mark, a spot that was supposedly insensitive to pain, which they would prick with a special needle. Or, even more damning, the witch's teat. And this could be any mole, any skin tag, any natural blemish, which they claimed was an extra nipple for the witch's imps to suckle blood from. Just think about that. Any common skin blemish, something almost every single person has, could be twisted into irrefutable proof of a pact with the devil, sealing their fate.
His methods were so brutal that even back in the 17th century, people started to object. They accused him of torture, and when he was challenged, Hopkins, ever the lawyer,
published a pamphlet called The Discovery of Witches just to defend his work. So let's take a look at his answer to the direct charge of using sleep deprivation to force confessions. You have to notice the cunning deflection here. He doesn't deny it. No, instead, he shifts the blame. He claims his cruelest practices were not only permitted, but demanded by the local authorities. Then he says he's since abandoned the practice. It's a classic case of "I was only following orders," painting himself as a humble public servant, not a torturer for hire. So, armed with these terrifying methods and the stamp of official approval, Hopkins and his small company, John Stearn and a female searcher, unleashed a wave of terror across East Anglia that really has no parallel in English history.
29. Just let that sink in for a moment. That is the number of people condemned for witchcraft at a single court session in Essex in July of 1645. And this was right after Hopkins' very first discoveries in his own hometown. This wasn't a slow start. It was an absolute explosion of accusations and death, as confessions that were extracted under torture implicated friends and family and neighbors in this ever-widening circle of horror.
23 pounds. Now that might not sound like a lot to us, but back in the 1640s, that was more than a skilled tradesman might earn in an entire year. And that was the fee paid to Matthew Hopkins by just one town, Stowmarket. He charged about 20 shillings per town, plus expenses. For 2 years, witch-finding was his full-time, profitable profession, and that reveals a powerful, sickening motive hiding behind all the supposed piety.
But behind all these numbers were real people with real lives. The case of John Lowes is horrifying proof that absolutely no one was safe. Here was a man who was the vicar of his parish for half a century, but he was unpopular. Hopkins' team kept him awake for days and nights on end, running him back and forth until his feet were blistered and he was completely delirious. They swam him in the castle moat. Broken, the 80-year-old man confessed that his demonic imps had sunk a ship off the coast. He was hanged, but not before being forced to read his own burial service.
His campaign spread like a plague. He and his associate John Stearn moved methodically from town to town. In Essex, Suffolk, and Norfolk alone, as you can see from this chart, it's estimated he was responsible for the deaths of around 200 people. But his total campaign across the region likely claimed many more lives, leaving a trail of terror, paranoia, and death in its wake.
But, a fire that burns that brightly and that destructively just can't last forever. As the reign of terror grew, so did the resistance. The sheer scale of the slaughter, combined with Hopkins' arrogant profiteering, finally began to turn the tide. A few brave individuals actually started to question the Witchfinder's authority and his methods.
One of the most prominent and frankly courageous critics was a clergyman named John Gall. While pretty much everyone else was paralyzed by fear or just swept up in the hysteria, Gall recognized this injustice for what it was. From his own pulpit in Huntingdonshire, he preached against Hopkins and his methods. He even published a book that decried the witch hunt as a total fraud, questioning the validity of forced confessions and the cruelty of his trials.
Hopkins' response? Well, it wasn't a reasoned theological debate. It was a chillingly passive-aggressive threat, and it was written to one of Gall's own parishioners. He dismisses Gall's criticism as just ignorance, and then he makes this veiled threat. "I'm coming to your town, and I'll probably be there soon." It just shows you exactly how he operated, using pure intimidation and the threat of accusation to silence anyone who dared to stand in his way.
But Gall's courage actually worked. It really marked the turning point. Public opinion started to shift. The authorities grew wary of all the chaos, and not to mention the expense. The Witchfinder's profitable, bloody campaign finally came to an end.
So what happened to him? Well, the historical record is pretty clear. Matthew Hopkins went back to Manningtree and died in his bed, likely from tuberculosis, in August 1647. He received no earthly punishment for his crimes. But history seemed to demand a more fitting end. A powerful legend emerged that angry locals had accused Hopkins himself of witchcraft, that they subjected him to his own swimming test, and when he floated, they executed him by his own methods. Now, it's a fiction, but it's a fiction that reveals a profound truth, that deep-seated human need for a kind of justice that the real world so often denies. History's final verdict is just damning and absolute. Later chroniclers didn't see Hopkins as some misguided zealot fighting evil. No, they saw him for exactly what he was, a parasitic opportunist, a man who exploited a time of national crisis, of religious fear, of broken authority, all for personal power and, above everything else, for profit.
Matthew Hopkins' short, brutal career serves as a really terrifying reminder of how thin the veil of civilization actually is. It shows how easily fear can be weaponized by the cynical and how quickly neighbors can turn on neighbors. His story leaves us with a final, lingering question. When the Witchfinder is finally gone, how does a society learn to trust itself again, especially after it willingly paid for the rope to hang its own people?